Legend. Legend. Legend.
Make that noise again.
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 Legend. Legend. Legend.
Make that noise again. Make that noise again.
I don't see that thinking it, I won't be able to do it.
Hello, everyone. I'm Professor Geek. Welcome back to the channel, and welcome back to another office hours stream. It has been a couple weeks. Last week, just so exhausted, man. It's been a rough couple of weeks, just busy-wise, because this is the time of the semester when so many papers, are turned in, and I teach a lot of classes, so I'm like grading and commenting and conferencing with students, and I am just fried at the end of the week. But this has been a good week, and this is a great weekend. She's not here yet. I think she's still finishing up a couple things before she jumps over on her computer. But my dear sound engraver and I are celebrating our second wedding anniversary this weekend. So 2 wonderfully magical years. We'll talk about that more when she gets on. But welcome to everyone who popped in. We're going to do some reviews and play catch up tonight a bit. It'll be fun. Let's see. Ghost Planet Max Inc., of course, popping in first. Always got a lot to say. I'm glad that this that my stream can be kind of a catharsis for you, Ghost Planet, just to get it all out. That's okay. Good. Glad you get to do that here. A troll, yes. Rest in peace, dear Ace Frehley. Man, this hurts. This one hurts bad. Whenever a person dies, period, it's a tragedy. Anytime a person dying is a bad thing. Even if they're, at a really old age and they were suffering a lot, you might say, well, at least they're out of pain, but it's still, death is a horrible thing. And so anytime a celebrity dies, people post about, oh, this and that, this person died. But sometimes, and it's always good to, mourn them or say rest in peace or whatever, or think back on the work that you enjoyed of theirs. But sometimes it'll be some celebrity that, to be honest, you haven't thought of them in ages anyway. And then, their death reminds you of them and reminds you of their work, and you go back and check it out again. And the thing about Ace Frehley, though, and this is going to be the case when some other individuals pass away who's really going to hurt. But the reason why Ace Frehley, Frehley passed away, I said Ace Frehley all in high school growing up. And it wasn't until later in life that I learned it's Ace Frehley is how you pronounce the name. But Space Ace, our dear Space Ace, he was still acting a rock star. He was still putting on amazing live shows. He had just released a killer solo album just a couple of years ago, the 10,000 Volts album. That's a really sweet album. Check it out. So he was somebody, like an Alice Cooper or Sammy Hagar that's still out there producing and making good stuff. It's not like, oh, I remember that guy, oh, I remember when I used to listen to their music. No, this is somebody that I was still following and still enjoying. And that really does suck. So rest in peace, Ace Frehley as well. He, of course, with Kiss, both in the 70s, early 80s, and in the 90s reunion. But he also had Frehley's Comet, which was a sweet rockin' band. And he put out a good number of solo albums. So Ace Frehley, yeah, you will be missed. And it was so sad, too. I think he'd had a stroke, which I don't know how severe it was, but it was enough for him to kind of postpone some tour dates anyway. But it was complications from a fall that it killed him. That's so sad. He was 74, which isn't all of that old, these days. People live way past that. So very sad. We mourn Ace Frehley. He was a master. He was, he inspired so many people to pick up guitar. Him is the spaceman with Kiss playing that Gibson and the sparks shooting out of the end of it and everything. Just awesome. Just awesome. Welcome, Big Al Presents. Crystal Ashes, good to see you there. Said it feels like longer. Well, it doesn't feel like longer to me. That's the good thing, Right. Feels like just the years are whipping on by with my dear sound engraver. Electric Barbarella, welcome to you. Hopefully you got all the cool Halloween decorations up there, Electric Barbarella. Um, Private Eye in Retrospectiva, Ace Moic, Imaginative Hobbyist, Stephen M, Nathaniel Zalozball, nearly forgot about us. Well, it's been 2 weeks, so don't blame you there. Jason Takes Middle Earth. Good name there. Welcome. A lot of chatting. Final Fantasy fan. Nerd Wizard. Good to see you. A Chol. Melwinus. Good to see you there. There's my dear sound engraver. Yes, my dear sound engraver. Yeah, 2 wonderful years. And the thing is, we don't fight. We've never had a fight. And people say, well, you don't really communicate then, or just wait, you will fight. And we always have to hear that crap. It's not that we don't discuss things or talk. We have misunderstandings. We have things that we need to discuss, or things that we'll feel differently about, a situation or an issue or something. But we just don't fight, because why would we want to berate each other? Fighting is when you're like yelling and snarking at each other, and we're adults and we love each other. So even if we disagree with each other, it doesn't mean we stop loving each other. And I always thought, well, maybe are we just weird? But then I heard Alice Cooper talk about him and his wife Cheryl, and they've been married since the 70s. I mean, they have a long marriage, and he said they've never fought a day in their life, and they're devoted to each other. They she goes on a tour with him and everything. And he said the same thing. He said, we'll discuss things. We'll talk about things, or if there's a misunderstanding or whatever. But no, why would we fight with each other? We like each other, So it has been wonderful 2 years. Here's to many, many more. All right. Let me before I get to the reviews. Oh, Leia Plus Size, good to see you there. I want to show you guys something that I picked up, a little collectible here. I just showed Sound Engraver the other night. She likes it too. I talk a lot about when I first got into comics. It was when I was like 8 or 9 years old in the Batman 89, phase when that came out, and it was Batmania, Batman merchandise everywhere. You go into a gas station and you'd see some Batman something or another. And it was all kinds of Batman stuff too. You could find stuff from Batman 66. You could find Batman, Tim Burton Batman stuff just everywhere. And it was so great. It was so wonderful. And I bought a lot of it in the day. And I've tried to hunt down some of the collectibles that I had in my room that day, or that era, that period, because it's so nostalgic. And I've been looking for this thing for a long time. I remember it was in my bedroom the way it was when I was a kid. I would lay in the bed, and this poster would be right here because my bed was against the wall. And this poster would be right here on the wall, and I would just lay and look up at it, Batman, how cool it is and everything. But it wasn't an official Batman 89. It wasn't licensed to the film. It was just a Batman. Looks like it's maybe, I don't know who did the art, but it's really sweet art. And but it was from the 80s there, and it's just a Batman poster that was released that time. So I couldn't find it anywhere. And finally, I found it on eBay. Somebody was selling a really great copy, no creases, no rips or tears. So I bought it and I put it in a frame. So the glass is going to reflect, glare a little bit, but I want to show you guys this. Do you guys ever see that? Have you guys ever had this? Because you have certain things you buy at a time, and it's so special to you, but it's not like officially licensed, or maybe no one else had it necessarily. Because this isn't like one of the Jack Nicholson Joker posters, or one of like I've got the Batman movie poster hanging over there. But this brings back so many memories. Such a cool pose too, jumping off the building and the lights and the purple sky. Just freaking love it. But very excited about that. Got it up on the door over there. I just took it down to show you guys. So just wanted to share that before I get started with the reviews and whatnot. One thing I'll kind of start off. Yeah, cool. Yeah, it's Ace Moic. Yeah, you say it's a nice homage to Miller DK Dark Knight Returns. I get it, because it is that pose. You're right. That's the pose of Dark Knight Returns. But what I like about it is that it's not Frank Miller's art, because I don't like Frank Miller's art. And I like that this is a Batman with proper long bat ears on the cowl. I like the blue and gray, or so it's black gray, so it's for black blue. It looks black in this picture, but looks a little more bluish if you see it in person. But so cool. And the proper yellow shield, yellow oval on the chest. I love it. It's really cool. So, oh, Al, you had that a long time ago. Sweet. Yeah, Big Al said had it a long time ago at a farmer's market. Sweet. I actually have a shirt that Big Al got. He gave it to me. It was an old shirt of his that has the Batman logo that he had custom made or whatever during the Batman '89 stuff, which is pretty cool. Um, all right, so the first review here I want to start off with is just giving you guys a heads up on something I told you about last time. Remember last time I was streaming a couple weeks ago, I reminded you of the Matt Wagner and Kelly Jones Dracula, the really great one that I had reviewed this volume last year, but I said that volume 2 had just been shipped to me, The Brides, and that I was going to review that this year. So I've read this and I want to go ahead and review this. Quickly though, just for anybody else who doesn't know about this, there is a new campaign they're doing. I'll put the link in the description. There's an ongoing series, and volume 3 is called The Count. So the series is called Dracula, and the shtick behind it, not shtick, but the the point behind it is that you're getting the tale from Dracula's point of view. So and of course, Dracula being an epistolary novel by Bram Stoker, you had everybody's perspective pretty much except for Dracula himself. You would get his words and his deeds and whatnot as seen or told through another character's recollection of them, so you get dialogue from him, but it wasn't him that was writing the reminiscence of it, or him, because everything in the Dracula novels, either a news article or a diary or a transposed phonograph recording or something like that. So all of these are from his perspective, and the first volume is like how he became a vampire, and it's really cool. It does some great stuff. It wasn't as gothic as I'd like it to be, I said, but it was excellent in its own right. It goes to the Scholomance, and it's all that kind of stuff. Dracula is true elemental evil in this too. It's none of this nonsense about, oh, he has a lost love or he's really not a bad guy. No, he's a straight up evil dude, and it's a really great kind of origin story there. And then volume 2, of course, is The Brides. How does Dracula get his brides? And what I love about this ongoing series that Matt Wagner and Kelly Jones are doing, Matt Wagner writes and Kelly Jones does the art, which is weird, because Matt Wagner does amazing art himself. In fact, I think this is a cover by Matt Wagner. Yeah, I got the Matt Wagner cover because he'll do some of the cover for the arts. But the inside is Kelly Jones. Try to find a good nudity-free page because some of it, it's an adult comic book, but really great Kelly Jones art there. Volume 2, I thought it was interesting that every step of the Dracula saga that they're telling, they take their cues from the Dracula novel. So they're trying to tell the story. It looks like The Count, the third volume that they've got a campaign for right now, is going to really get into the actual happenings of the novel at that point, because he wants to, by the end of this volume, he wants to move to London. He wants to go there and stuff like that. So, he will get into the actual events of the novel. But of course, in the novel, he has these 3 brides, and they come out of nowhere. If you guys know, you've read Dracula. They're so iconic, though. They're not even in the book all that much. They have that brief little scene in the beginning with Jonathan Harker, and then they come back in the end when Van Helsing has to face them, as they're trying to face off against Dracula ultimately. But they're so iconic. The number 3 is very iconic anyway, especially when you got 3 women. That's like the 3 phases of motherhood or womanhood rather, maiden, mother, crone, and all this kind of pagan, aspects to the 3 women. And it just fits that Dracula would have these 3 brides, but we don't know much about them. In the novel, all we get is, and they actually write a little introduction about it here, and they start it with the little clip we have from it. It's Jonathan Harker talking. He says, "There was something about them that made me uneasy, some longing, and at the same time some deadly fear. They whispered together, and then they all 3 launched. Such a silvery music. They all 3 laughed. Such a silvery musical laugh, such as hard as the. It's hard to read this red text on this black background in this light. But as hard as though the sound could have never come through the softness of human lips. The fair girl shook her head coquettishly, and the other 2 urged her on. One said, 'Go on, you are the first, and we shall follow. Yours is the right to begin,' the other one added. 'He is young and strong. There are kisses for us all.' The fair girl went on her knees and bent over me, fairly gloating. I could see in the moonlight the monstrous shining on the scarlet lips and the red tongue as it lapped the sharp white teeth." That's your introduction, and your really only description you get of the brides in the novel. And of course, they come back in the end. And so you have this mystery. Okay, so there's one of them that's a fair one. You can see the blonde here in the book that we have here, and she has some sort of right, a right to go first or something like that. And we never get the explanation of that. it's even though that scene and the brides have become so iconic, in Dracula lore, they were also that scene was also a really important moment in Bram Stoker writing the novel, because he said, in many writings and whatnot in his journals, that he had a dream of these three vampire women coming at him, and which is very erotic, I mean, these women coming into him, he's laying down on a bed or whatever. So, but that dream kind of spurned him to write the whole novel, and then he got interested in the idea of Dracula, which we know was definitely based a lot on his his overbearing employer at the time and whatnot. So it's an important scene, and we have a whole volume. And I was like, well, why? We need to bridge the gap. They need to bridge, because Dracula is an ancient being, and they want to have his roots, as is explained in the novel. His roots of Dracula are far, far predated the events that happened in the novel, not just as the living Vlad Tepes, but the actual, him as a vampire. Vlad Tepes has come about and returned as a vampire, as the undead, long, long before the events of the novel. So if the first volume is going to tell the origin of Dracula, how he becomes a vampire and so forth, then you need some sort of connective tissue between that ancient origin and then the events of the novel, which we'll get into with volume 3. And I thought it was interesting that they organized the events, that connective tissue, around the gaining of his three brides. And it really does get you in his mindset. Like, after the gaining of each bride, he's like, you are mine to do with as I please, I mean, this is Dracula's mindset, right? And it's fascinating too, because he's kind of lonely, so he'll get one bride, and she's the type of person he thinks he'd want to be with at that time in his development or personality, right? He thinks, oh, I'd want a total servant, a submissive servant. But then she ends up not being enough, like intellectually for him, so he goes for the second one, and she's a little bit more of a noble woman. That's why she has the right, to go first and so forth. So it's so great. Let's see. Good. Okay. Gotcha. Sorry, Sound Engraver messaged me something just to make sure she wasn't telling me there was a problem with the stream or something. And then you get the third one. So it's really great connective tissue there. And it does kind of make sense that you would organize this part of the story around his acquisition of the brides, because that really does sum up really well his development as a character. How do we go from, Vlad the Impaler, the Vlad, the warlord, actual in real life, to becoming a vampire, to get the man who wants to go to London, or not the undead, right? The count who wants to go to London by the top of the novel. And this really develops his character nicely, his situation around him, how he's dealing with the villages around him, and all of that. So it's I can't recommend it enough. It's really solid, a lot of fun. And if you miss these, obviously, if you're just hearing about it or whatever, the campaign for volume 3 does allow you to pick up these two as well. I think you can pick them up used, but I don't know if you can get a good hard copy used like this. So, I mean, not hardcover, rather. I mean, hard copies, they're all hard copies. You can get paperbacks and whatnot. But I think at least if you go to the campaign, and what you need to do is, if you want to search for it right now before I actually give you a link, look up Orlok Press. That's the name of their publishing company, Orlok, like Count Orlok from Nosferatu there. Just do a Google search for Orlok Press, and you'll see the campaign for this. So definitely worth it if you're a Dracula fan at all. This is done really quite well, so I recommend it. See if you guys are any comments on that or anything before I move along. You guys talking about watching some pretty cool stuff on your own? Yeah, Leia Plus says, I agree. The brides in Van Helsing, that was really cool, and it's fun to watch even today with the CGI being super outdated. Of course, it wasn't outdated, in the 2000s, but those brides are so. My favorite bride moment in the Van Helsing is when they're talking to brother. I forgot the friar's name there, the guy who plays Professor Lupin in Harry Potter, but he's there, and the bride jumps up behind him or whatever, and he's like, oh, and she's like, did I scare you? And he's like, no. And then she's like, I'll need to try harder. And then she like vamps out or whatever. And that was one of my favorite moments. But that was a cool portrayal of the brides too, because they would be these three, beautiful women, who looked vampirish with the fangs, but otherwise they were just, these beautiful women, these gowns, but then they would transform into these bat-like, horrid, disgusting creatures, So it was a pretty cool pretty cool interpretation. The other thing I want to talk about before I get to um, movie reviews here, I did a review a little while ago on the video game The Quarry, which I absolutely loved. And I gave a review. I even have some spoilers in the review, but I told you when to not listen if you don't want the spoilers. It's such a fun game. I'm actually replaying it right now, trying to get a different ending because those interactive narrative kind of games, I just love them when they're done well. And I was so happy with The Quarry. It was so much fun. Really did love it. And then I was so bummed when I looked at kind of other guys. I was thinking, wait, did they do some other games like this? And then I looked at their trilogy that they did, or their series, the anthology series, which just reeks of wokeness. Just like I haven't touched, I haven't even played a single moment of it, but you can just see from the trailers, it just reeks of wokeness from every pore of the stupid anthology series. And I'm kind of bummed because one of them even dealt with H.H. Holmes, you know, America's like first serial killer, which is a fascinating, horrific moment of American history, but still a fascinating one nonetheless. But it's so disgusting to look at. The characters are like every other uh, woke Rainbow Brigade that you would see. They're just they act horrible in the trailers. I want nothing, no part of that. But people were telling me that I really should play Until Dawn, which was their first game they did before they did that stupid anthology series. And it I think it was released in like 2016. And I thought, well, maybe, but they said it had to do with the Wendigo legend, which isn't a spoiler. That's just kind of like how it's promoted or how it's publicized. But the Wendigo, I was like, well, that's cool. I like the Wendigo idea. And it's set in this dark night of winter, and that's cool. But it just, I don't know. For whatever reason, I just got desperate one night because I was looking for something to play, just a new game to take my mind off of things. And it ended up, I just tried Until Dawn. I'm so glad I did. Until Dawn is so epic. I don't know what the heck happened to this company. They put out Until Dawn, which is so fun and so solid. And then they just go, pardon the phrase, but it's the only way to say it, batshit crazy, as the whole freaking world did during the woke garbage years there of the late teens, and put out this stupid anthology series. But thankfully, luckily, they came back and released The Quarry at the end of that. So maybe there's hope that we'll get another game. I hope so. That's decent. But Until Dawn, no one told me the cast in it. Hayden Panettiere, who I really enjoy her work, her voice work even. She played Kyrie in Kingdom Hearts. And, I enjoyed her on Heroes back in the day, and I've seen some of her stuff. But then Brett Dalton is actually in this game too, who, of course, as a big Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. fan, he's Ward from Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. And I thought it was so funny too, because he would have been like 36, a good deal older than the other actors. But because it's just motion capture for a video game, they can make him however old or young they want it to. So all of the actors did a great job in this. And it's a cool exploration, the first one they ever did. I see so many resonance of it in The Quarry now that I'm replaying The Quarry again, because they're kind of going back to that magic of their first outing in this genre, which was Until Dawn. And it's so good. They've got the usual sort of tropish characters around. You got to have teenagers, and there's got to be like a nerd, and then a jock, and then a sex kitten vixen, just kind of over sexualized, and then sort of a nerdish girl or a prudish girl. Where they've got the whole they've got it down, and they do it in a fresh way, though. I think it's really unique. And some of the resonances, I see a lot of story beats are similar themes from Until Dawn. They were showing back up in The Quarry. It's kind of weird because I played The Quarry first, but the Wendigo and is a kind of lycanthropy ish legend. It's not a lycanthrope. It's a Native American Indian kind of legend, and it's a terrifying one. They don't really talk about it too much. Somebody wears a Wendigo mask in the game, and they don't give a lot of the hardcore, terrifying background of what a Wendigo is. It's a creature with a unending hunger, and a hunger for flesh, so much so that Wendigo they'll eat their own lips. And it's terrifying. Like, they just can't consume enough. And that's why they go out and try and eat people. And they're like these sort of big werewolf type monsters or whatever, or beastish monsters. Sometimes they're portrayed with like antlers or whatever, but somebody wears a Wendigo mask in the game, and you can see like the lips are all eaten up and the flesh and everything. It's terrifying. So yeah, it's a solid game, solid story. You've got a backstory exposition with the characters. All of the characters feel very fleshed out and real. I'm really impressed with that. Again, it's kind of like, The Quarry. Maybe it's just the ending that I got. Like I said, my only criticism of The Quarry was that I felt like the denouement was kind of crappy. Like I just got a couple little, paragraphs. Oh, this is what happened to the characters afterwards. I'm like, no, I was just in these characters' heads. I was really spending time with them in a fleshed out story. You got to give me more than that. But I said, I don't know if maybe the ending's a little different, if I'll get more of a denouement if I play through a different ending. So I'm trying that. But I will say that Until Dawn has a proper denouement. Maybe I just hit the right ending for that. I did make it to where everybody survived. No one died. I wasn't able to do that in my first playthrough of The Quarry. But I'd like to play through Until Dawn again at some point to try and get some more of the collectibles and get a slightly different ending. I won't tell you exactly what I want because I don't want it to spoil it for anybody looking to play it. But just a solid. There's one weird. There's I don't know if there's characters like this in their anthology series either, but Until Dawn has a character who her character is supposed to be the bitch. That's who she's supposed to be. And she is so over the top bitchy. So over the top bitchy. I wanted to let her die so badly, but I'm like, no, I wanted the trophy where you let them all live. You save everybody. But man, I might have to play it through again and just let her get eaten by the Wendigo. I mean, she's like, that's the only thinly written character. She's so bitchy that it's like obvious they're just writing her to a two-dimensional kind of thing, they try to, some other characters mention a couple of little things, like the psychologist that you meet in between levels will say something about, oh, it's her insecurity or this and that, but she's pretty two-dimensional and bitchy. Emily, yeah, that's her name. And it's interesting because in The Quarry you have Caitlin, the other Asian, because these are Asian girls, and Caitlin's a little bitchy. She's nowhere near the levels of Emily though. And she's a little bit more of a a three-dimensional character that I actually enjoy spending time with a little bit more. So yeah, just cool cast. I hope they do another one. I hope they I hope they've gotten their stupid anthology crap out of their system and they give us another great game like The Quarry or Until Dawn. Because I'm just again shocked that it's a newer game that I could play and enjoy because I'm running out of those. I have started playing Dragon Quest Origins. Dragon Quest? Yeah, Dragon Quest Origins. The other BioWare game that I hadn't played. I love the Star Wars Old Republic. I love Mass Effect. So I'm trying to play to get into Dragon's Quest Origin, and then I'll play Dragon Quest 2. Not going to touch Inquisitions, but hopefully these two games I'll like. I'm still kind of in the beginning of Dragon Quest Origins, and I haven't Dragon Age. Thank you, not Dragon Quest. I knew Dragon Quest was wrong. Dragon Age Origins, but I haven't played it enough to really get hooked into the world yet. I'm still kind of learning about the world and everything. So I'll keep playing it and keep giving it a chance. Hopefully it'll lock me in there. Yeah, Sam Raimi is great in The Quarry. Yeah, definitely. And who is the guy that plays in Until Dawn? Is it Rami Malek? Is that his name? Or am I confusing him with another actor? But he plays Josh in Until Dawn. He does a good job too. Yeah, Dragon Quest, totally different franchise. I knew it was wrong. I knew it was wrong when I was saying it, but I couldn't think of anything else that followed Dragon. I even looking at the console game over there, but it's too far away from my nearsighted eyes to focus in on. All right. Sorry, all the noise this Pepsi Kid's making. What else? Okay, so let's also finally let's talk about some Hammer Horror Dracula. It seems like I've been stretching this out forever, but it's because I missed a couple of weeks and I'm trying to give the different eras of Hammer Horror their due. And so we talked about the first blow on the scene, because the reason I'm doing this is this year I'm looking at the evolution of the archetypal trilogy of monsters: Dracula, Frankenstein, and the Wolfman. The Wolfman comes from Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So each three of these archetypal monsters have their roots in a really seminal canon piece of American literature or English literature, but they stick around with us. They're still with us today, these archetypal monsters, even once the slasher phase started to hit and everything like that. Nothing's going to shake these archetypal monsters from our consciousness. So I was looking this year, and we talked about that last year, the historical origins of it, the societal tensions and anxieties and behind the creation of them, and we really gave some good literary analyses or good in-depth explorations of the literary works and talked about their initial translation to the screen. So this year I'm trying to focus a little bit more on the evolution of those archetypes, and a big step in the evolution of all three is Hammer Horror. You go from Universal to Hammer. Yes, there are other other movies were made, like B movies, and I talked about like the Return of Dracula, or what's the other one? I talked about Frankenstein's Daughter, which isn't a good movie, but was so funny anyway. Yeah, other movies made, about these characters. But I think if you look back at which movies really had an impact on culture, Hammer horror definitely. Because even if you picture Dracula, like I said, in those little AI thumbnails that I create, I just tell ChatGPT to show me a picture of Dracula, Frankenstein, the Wolfman, and it gives me the image of the universal monsters. But you can see influences from Christopher Lee's Dracula because suddenly the fangs. Bela Lugosi didn't have fangs; they didn't show that back then. So you get the fangs, you get a little bit more of a taller, debonair, Christopher Lee character. And we talked about the explosion on the scene of Curse of Frankenstein and Horror of Dracula, the first two movies of both of those characters from horror. And then we actually looked at the evolution of the Frankenstein movies throughout the 60s. So I want to talk a little bit about the Dracula sequels because these were really fascinating movies. And I'm not really going to say so much about the non-Dracula Hammer vampire movies because Hammer did some other vampire movies. Some are quite good, are fun, for horror films that don't necessarily don't have the Dracula in the title or whatever. But let's talk about a little of these because what I love most about Dracula is the good versus evil conflict. I hate movies where they try and make it a little more, vague as to, who really would win, and maybe there is nothing good that could stand up against evil. I hate that. I like a good seminal good versus evil story. It's one of the reasons why I like Dracula as a character. That's what it was in the original novel and whatnot. And in that sense, you gotta freaking love Van Helsing and Peter Cushing's Van Helsing. We said, when we're going to talk even more about how great Christopher Lee is of Dracula, but Peter Cushing's Van Helsing, he just makes him such a freaking superhero. So good. He's good in horror Dracula. We talked about that. But the next Dracula movie that Hammer did was called Brides of Dracula. And it actually doesn't include the character of Dracula. They just called it Brides of Dracula. They wanted to do a sequel. The first one was so popular, they needed to do a sequel. And this would have been like 60, 61, something like that. And Christopher Lee, though, didn't want to come back to the character. He was always very concerned about being pigeonholed into these characters. It's why when he played Frankenstein's monster in the first Frankenstein movie they did, he wanted the creature to be completely destroyed. So he's, in a vat of acid, at the end of that movie. And he didn't want to come back as Dracula. So they did a movie. They said, well, let's just do another Dracula movie. Dracula's dead at this point because they kill him at the end of Horror of Dracula. So let's do another movie about the cult of vampire that Dracula had spawned. So you get this character, Baron von, is it von Meister? I think I forget the character's name. Really fascinating character and a fascinating setup. The cool thing about all of these successive Dracula movies, whether they feature Christopher Lee as Dracula or not, is that Hammer keeps taking little influences and little parts again from the Dracula novel that maybe they didn't develop so much in the previous film. So Brides of Dracula opens with a foreigner, she's a French girl in this case, not an English man, but coming through Dracula's country, traveling through there and stopping at an inn. And they're like, oh, you must stay in here tonight because it's dangerous out there and whatnot. So sort of a, Harker kind of esque journey there. And the Baron has a mother who is, it's just so fascinating. I don't want to give if you haven't seen it, I'm not going to give away some spoilers, but it's such a cool setup. And for a Dracula movie to not even feature the character of Dracula, it does feature on this character, Baron von Meister, getting these brides, these three women, these brides or whatever. So they call it Brides of Dracula because ultimately they're all in the cult of Dracula. So it's a little bit of a cheat, but it works, whatever. It's a good enough movie that it works. But really who shines in this film, again, Baron von Meister is a great, really cool, villain. But Van Helsing, Peter Cushing is Van Helsing. This is probably, it's one of my favorite Dracula movies ever. And I hesitate to say that because it doesn't technically even include Dracula, but it's one of my favorite movies because of Van Helsing is so freaking awesome in this movie. Peter Cushing's Van Helsing is such a Batman in this movie, such a Batman. At one point, a vampire actually bites him and he takes a piece of steel, holds it in the fire, and burns the poison out of the bite on his neck with a blazing piece of steel, and then pours holy water on it, just to stop the poison from taking. Like, dude, you're a badass. And the way he kills the villain at the end is so swashbuckling. I mean, the first Horror of Dracula, he's like jumping across the table. He pulls down the drapes with the sun, and he grabs these candlesticks and he makes a cross out of them, and really wicked cool in that too. The way he does it at the end of this movie, I won't spoil it for you, but it involves a windmill, and it's just like, dang, you are awesome. And Peter Cushing's so great in the role, and he really just makes Van Helsing a fun character you like to root for. Um, Van Helsing doesn't come back as a character in the Dracula sequels, I think, until Dracula AD, if I'm remembering. I'm going through them in order here as we talk about them, so if I misremember that, I'll correct myself. But when Christopher Lee comes back in the next movies, Peter Cushing isn't there, but he did get to do a couple movies with Christopher Lee again, the two, like, as he plays Van Helsing's ancestor or descendant in Dracula AD and in Satanic Rites of Dracula. But so we had Dracula, Brides of Dracula. They eventually do get Christopher Lee to come back. I think they gave him the starring role in Rasputin, if he would do the Dracula movie. And the next one was the names run together in my mind. It wasn't Dracula's Risen from the Grave. It's Dracula Prince of Darkness. That was this one. And they've got this really cool character they invent by the name of Clove, who's a human butler that Dracula had. And, Dracula has human servants, like you had the gypsies in the novel and stuff like that. So a human servant, and it's pretty wicked. These unwary travelers, this like two brothers and their wives traveling through the countryside, staying in the castle. And then Clove just like, he ends up killing one of them and hanging him upside down and slitting his throat and letting his blood gush out on the ashes of Dracula to revive him. It's just like, man, this is wicked. This is cool stuff. But the really cool thing about Dracula Prince of Darkness is the monk. There's a friar in this movie, a priest, friar, monk, who we don't have Van Helsing, but this is a really cool character. I forget his name, Father so-and-so or Brother so-and-so, but he's his own like vampire slayer, and he's a really cool character. He knows the deal. They endear him to you at the beginning when he stops this one, ritual burning or whatever, or staking of this dead girl, because she clearly wasn't a vampire and her poor mother's wailing, and he's a great character. He's a great character. And he, he has to, they kill Dracula at the end of this one in a pretty unique way. It's common in a lot of some vampire lore, even some like mountain lore of like devils and stuff like that, are ghosts and spirits and whatnot, that they can't cross running water. They can't cross running water. And really what that goes back to, ultimately, a lot of people say, oh, it's the purity, it's the element or whatever. Well, what it really goes back to is that people being baptized, you're supposed to be baptized in a source of running water. That's what I think they mentioned in the Didache, some of the early church fathers and whatnot. Baptism in a fount of running water or something like that, or at least pouring the water so that it runs. It's not just that kind of thing. But I think that's where it goes back to. But it's an interesting aspect, and they bring in some really interesting aspects in Prince of Darkness. There's a Renfield type character. We do have like a person who's driven mad and eating flies, so we have a Renfield like character in Dracula Prince of Darkness. Really solid stuff. So I recommend that as well. That was a great movie. Next one was Dracula Has Risen from the Grave, which is a pretty fascinating one too. This one, Dracula Has Risen from the Grave, I said before, is probably the most Catholic of all the Dracula movies. I mean, it's about this priest has kind of lost his faith because of his terror of Dracula, and he comes. Oh, it's really good. He has to find his faith again by the end. And there's a Monsignor who is fighting against Dracula. At a certain point, there's a main character who thinks of himself as an atheist, but by the end, he finds his own faith and trying to fight against Dracula too. It's a very Christian Catholic movie for a Dracula movie. I was really impressed with it. Just watched it for the second time this year, just to kind of freshen up on it, for this talk. So I'm seeing, so far as we're going through in Dracula's portrayal in these Hammer horror movies, they really indelibly stamp Dracula against religion, or Dracula is the, religion is the real thing that can, he's the enemy of religion. He's a satanic kind of stand-in, character. It really is good versus evil. Christopher Lee was done with the movies at that point. He really just wanted to step away. So they decided, well, we'll just do another, kind of like Brides of Dracula. They decided we'll just do another Dracula movie, which has doesn't have Dracula in it. So they had the really cool setup. They had Ralph Bates, great actor. He played Frankenstein later. who would step up as kind of like a devotee of Dracula, a count or whatever, who's like a devotee of Dracula years later, and he wants to kind of drink his blood and be sort of possessed with the spirit of Dracula. That was the idea of it. But the American distributors were like, we're not touching this movie unless you get Christopher Lee. We want actual Dracula in this movie. So they kind of Christopher Lee said they kind of blackmailed him, or not blackmailed him. They kind of, manipulated him emotionally, like, look, if you don't do this movie, all these people are going to lose their jobs and lose this work. So he came back and did it. So when the guy drinks the blood of Dracula, he dies, and Dracula's kind of reborn within him, and it's Christopher Lee again. But it's a fascinating one too, because you have these noblemen, these three noblemen, and you find this out at the very beginning of the movie, so it's not a spoiler. But these three noblemen who have very respectable lives, they have wives in the community and their charitable work and all of this stuff. But every month they get together and go into a distant town, and they total hedonism. They go to whorehouses, and they're trying to find what's the next thrill in life, and all of this kind of stuff. And then they meet the Ralph Bates character who takes them to find Dracula. I was like, you really want to let's devote yourself to a satanic mass and all this kind of stuff. And really cool way how Dracula dies at the end of this one too. He ends up falling on a reconsecrated altar, which is pretty freaking awesome. Because there's this church which has sort of become a tomb, and it's a cool. There's more to it than that. I'll let you watch it, but it's a really sweet ending for Dracula in that as well. So again, we're seeing that that kind of formulation there. There's one movie in between before we jump to Dracula AD, in which they brought him into modern times. And a lot of people crap on this movie, Scars of Dracula. A lot of people say, this was the weakest in the series. I don't get that. I really don't get that. The interesting thing about Scars of Dracula is that it doesn't really follow continuity. It's kind of like a soft reboot, kind of like some of the Frankenstein sequels were. It gives you your own it's a new kind of backstory about Dracula and the village. Had sort of burned his castle, but he survived. He has Clove again, different actor and a very different take on Clove, but the human butler kind of guy again. And really some cool aspects. The cool thing about Scars of Dracula is that Dracula in general, the idea of the character is kind of a wolf. I mean, and what I mean by wolf is like a womanizer, like a wolf, a guy who goes out just trying to score as many women as he can. Dracula is a great metaphor for that, because Dracula always yearns and lusts for the blood of a young maiden woman, or even not maiden, but a young woman. He wants the blood of a young woman. And quite often in these movies, once he gets her blood, once he turns her, he sort of doesn't want anything to do with her anymore. It's like, no, I've had it. I had your virginity, or I had your sexual encounter, is the connection to like a lot of womanizing wolf, type people. And then he doesn't want anything to do with them again. He'll use them a little bit, but he ends up usually killing them or something like that, or doesn't care if they die. But he's always off on his next conquest, And the interesting thing about Scars of Dracula is that the Casanova type character or whatever, that's a good way of putting it too, is that it opens with a human character who's that type of character, always trying to conquest a new woman and stuff like that. And he eventually comes into contact with Dracula, and then it's his brother and his fiance are trying to come look for him. That's the whole momentum of the story. But I like that juxtaposition of Dracula, the great metaphorical, wolfish Casanova womanizer, against a real one, a human, a real human. So that was cool. It played with the themes really well. I thought it was a fine movie. Like I said, it's not continuity to the other sequels, but I still thought it was good. I thought it was really fun. See, people are talking about that. Make sure I'm not missing anything. Blood, the essence of us living. Yeah, that's for Taste the Blood of Dracula too. That was a big theme in that. Yeah, Dracula, he's a badass. This is an interesting question. I just want to get it here before I go too far, because we are going to talk about Dracula AD here in a second. But kind of jumping topics for a moment. Chaotician says, last year we're talking about werewolves, and we are going to still talk about some werewolves here before Halloween, because we'll jump into some more of that stuff movie-wise. But what do you think lycanthropy means from a feminine perspective? Last year you talked about the masculine side of it. You're right. And it mainly is a masculine archetype, but there's been some really great explorations of the feminine lycanthrope. The Howling had some great she wolf, representations of that. Of course, you can go into something like Ginger Snaps, which is pretty fun as well. But the cool thing about the werewolf is that it's a very Dionysian monster. And what I mean by Dionysian is that the Apollonian Dionysian divide or dichotomy in a lot of characters or types of characters. So a vampire is usually, not always, if you're like a Matheson vampire, then it's not going to be like this. But usually a vampire like a Count Dracula is very Apollonian. And what I mean by these two terms, Apollonian and Dionysian, Nietzsche might have been one of the first ones to use this, but Apollo and Dionysus were both sons of Zeus. So they're both sons of God, and they're both patron gods of very similar things: music, art, theater, stuff like that. Yet, if you know anything about the gods' characters, Apollo and Dionysus, they couldn't be farther apart. Apollo is very ordered, is structured, is self-control, the golden mean, that kind of thing. Whereas Dionysus is, Bacchus, as he's called in Roman terms, he's the one, the bacchanals in the woods with all of his dryads, drunken orgies, that's Dionysus. And the fun thing about the interesting thing about these characters is, so they're both, say, the patron god of like music, but Dionysus would be the god of the aspect of music that can carry you away, that speaks to your emotions, that gets you wound up, that kind of aspect of music. Whereas Apollo would be the god of music in terms of like the scales and the music theory and how it all logically, makes the mathematic sense and so forth. And same thing with theater. Apollo would be the god of the aspect of theater, like the verse, the specific, rules and forms of it, whereas Dionysus would be the god of like the catharsis and the way that theater can just get you wound up and round up and work on you emotionally and whatnot. And it's fascinating that in Greek times, at the Apollo of Delphi, at the Oracle of Delphi, which is a temple to Apollo, there was a little mini altar to Dionysus. And then at the theater, all of the theaters would have a little mini, which were clearly, devoted to Dionysus, would have a little, mini altar to Apollo too. So there was always this idea in Greek minds that you couldn't have one without the other. You weren't, a devotee of Apollo and you hated Dionysus, or you were a devotee of Dionysus, you hated Apollo. That wouldn't make sense to the Greek mind. They believed in the golden mean. So, you need to have sort of Apollo and Dionysus both living within you, which translate that to like modern psychology. And you're talking about the aspect of the shadow in yourself. You can't just repress and deny any bad or dark impulses you have. You have to acknowledge them. If you're not going to just repress them to the point where they blast out and you start acting on them randomly, you need to acknowledge them and try to integrate them in a healthy manner into your life, So it's, again, it's a similar kind of psychology there, but that's all a big background of the terms to what we talk about the types of monsters they are. So Dracula would be more of an Apollonian monster in that he's very, he's a little more logical. If he wants to conquer a woman, he's going to try to seduce her or orchestrate the situation, get her guardian to leave or whatever so that he can be there. He's more of a planner. Whereas a werewolf is just a person who turns into a werewolf and then they're just like total Hulk mode. They're just a wild animal, So that's more of a Dionysian kind of thing. And both men and women obviously have different Dionysian aspects to them. And it's interesting that the woman lycanthropes are quite oftentimes going to be linked in some way, even if it's just sort of thematically, to their menstrual cycles. I'm just telling you how it is in stories. You can hate that if you want, but it's a fact. And even if it's not directly to say a menstrual cycle, it's still directly to their cycle of the moon, because werewolves in the full moon, that's all linked, so you can't not acknowledge that. And a woman going through lycanthropy will typically be like the maiden's emergence into the sexual creature. That's like Ginger Snaps, or Howling, did that really well too. And there are some other, explorations of that as well. The book, The Howling, the novel, the movies did it in their own unique way, but the novel, The Howling, was really interesting exploration of that too. So yeah, there's a lot we can go into that with. But yeah, we haven't thus far, and we'll go into it again maybe some more. But hopefully that kind of answers your question, or gets you started on some ideas or research on your own. But yeah, pretty fascinating subject. Okay, so Dracula AD. There was two more movies that Hammer movies anyway that Christopher Lee did with Dracula. It was Dracula AD and Satanic Rites of Dracula. There's a Golden Circle, or I forget, the Seven Vampires, whatever, I forget the title of it. That still dealt with Dracula and Peter Cushing, but Christopher Lee wasn't playing Dracula in that one. There is a movie that Christopher Lee did. Some people were asking about my thoughts on it too, called The Count Dracula, which wasn't a Hammer film, but it was a movie that they billed as trying to be way more faithful to the novel. You can find it if you just look for Christopher Lee and the Count Dracula movie. And on the one hand, it's way more faithful to the novel than some of the other movies have been, but it still makes these wide diversions from the novel, which I'm kind of like, what? Why? Like, you didn't need to make that diversion. If your thing, if your shtick in this movie is we're going to be faithful to the novel, they made some weird changes, like, combining characters or swapping character names or just doing some silly changes that don't even really make sense, from like, oh, well, they had to, save money on the set for this or whatever. So that's why they did that. It was just some bizarre changes that they made. Again, it's still a fine movie. It's probably the most technically faithful to the novel up to that point, but it's not even on my list of favorite Dracula movies. I think Horror of Dracula is a way fun, more fun movie, and better storytelling, I even think, than Horror of Dracula. But if you want to see Christopher Lee and the proper mustache of Vlad, and everything, it's there and it's worth a watch. But Dracula AD was Hammer's decision to finally bring the character into their contemporary times. So we've gone through the 60s at this point, and I think it's not the first movie ever to bring Dracula into the contemporary times of the movie, because like the Return of Dracula did that to the 60s there, or early 60s, and they made that, or late 50s, yeah, I think it was late 50s when they made that film. I talked about it. But Dracula AD really just solidified it in a way that I think has been copied a lot since then. Or at least taken inspiration from in a lot since then. The idea of Dracula being brought back to life in modern times, and what does that mean? Who do you find? Because you don't have vampire slayers out here in modern, Western civilization. So who do you get? Well, you get Van Helsing's descendant, who happens to be an anthropology professor, see, and an expert on occult, goings on. And of course, police have to be involved, but there's a police detective who uses Van Helsing as a consultant, and kind of comes around to this way of believing in these things and these threats that are out there. And you get that in both Dracula AD and Dracula, or the Satanic Rites of Dracula. And what's interesting about those movies, they're not my favorite either. I far prefer the period movies that were done earlier. I don't think any of them really top the original Horror of Dracula, but they're fun movies. They're great. You've got Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing. What's not to like? They're even filmmaking wise, camera angle wise, they're a little bit more contemporary of the time in the 70s, some camera angles and this and that. There's a different feel to a period movie. It's more than just setting and costumes, and the mod, music and stuff like that, set in 70 Britain, 1970, 72 or whatever Britain. It's not horrible. It's not horrible, and they're fun, but it's an important step in the mythology again, because who how does Dracula have to operate in the modern world? He can't just own a castle and do what he wants. There's a lot more law enforcement. He has to kind of go underground and use some like corporations and things like that. It's fascinating, take on that. And how do people combat, the evil, especially if the evils, if the cult of Dracula has woven its way into some of the government or something like that. So it's some really cool new themes and new challenges and new angles and aspects to take on it. That I would recommend checking into. I still prefer in general the period piece Dracula, because that's more archetypal, but good nonetheless. They're fun. Yeah. Ace Moik said, yeah, because it opens with the there's a devotee of Dracula there at this party, but it's just a bunch of hippies, like crashing this like uppity upper class London, party, and they've got their band there. It was a real band. I forget the name of them, but they were like a rock soul slash band playing this modern music, and all the hippies dancing around and stuff. It was pretty funny. Yeah. All right. And they've done it in other ways. Maybe we'll talk about it eventually when we get to it, like with the Dracula 2000 the Wes Craven produced movies, which aren't great movies, but again, if you're looking at the evolution of the character, and the archetype and what it means for our culture, it's interesting to check those out. And they're not, I don't think they're like unwatchable. They're fun if you just kind of give yourself over to a fun horror film. Um, we're probably not gonna, we're definitely not gonna make it all the way through looking at the evolution of these three characters this year before Halloween. We've got I think 2 more weeks or one more office hours before Halloween, and then I'll probably wrap things up the Saturday night after Halloween, with this all stuff. But that's what we did last year. We started looking at these archetypes and then stopped at a certain point and picked it up the next year. We will eventually branch out. Maybe next year we'll branch out too to start looking at the influence of the characters like the Mummy or our Creature of the Black Lagoon type characters, in which I would broaden that into sort of mysteries of nature type characters, which I think is not necessarily like a Godzilla, because that's sort of a like an atomic age, atomic power, but mysteries of nature is like, um, what wonders and dangers are still out there that we have yet to discover, as far as we feel like we've conquered this whole earth and we know all of the science and all of the things, there are still dark corners in the ocean or the rainforest or whatever you don't know about, and you don't know what may be lurking there. So that's awesome to look at. So we'll check in more of that too. But it's fun. I'm just enjoying it. One thing, I don't know if I have enough time to say this. Let me just check in with you guys. I did read. Well, maybe I'll talk about it a little bit. I read Richard Matheson's Hell House. I said I was going to read it this year. Doug Brody mentioned it to me, said I should read it because it's such a seminal, important haunted house piece of, you have to read The Haunting of Hell House by Shirley Jackson. You have to read Hell House by Richard Matheson. And I never read Hell House. I talked about how I really tend to not enjoy Matheson's fiction because I had read Somewhere in Time and I Am Legend. I don't think he's a bad writer. I think he's got amazing ideas. I don't enjoy his execution of them all that well. I do tend to love scripts of his that make it to film or make it to not film but television shows, like episodes of like Star Trek he wrote or Twilight Zone he wrote. But again, the writer writes that script and then it gets altered by the producer and the director and the actors acting or put their interpretation on it. So anytime a writer makes, unless the writer's like a showrunner, the writer's script is going to be a joint a collaboration piece of storytelling by the time it hits screen. And I have enjoyed that because I like Matheson's ideas. He's got great ideas. But I wanted to read Hell House, give it one more chance. And because it's such a seminal piece of, canon work of haunted house literature. I really hated this book. And I don't mean I hated it like it's a poorly written book. No, I get it. I understand why it's canon haunted house literature. I understand it. I'm just speaking from my personal taste. I hate his characters. It's so hard for me to find a character that Matheson writes for me to even root for or to become invested in. These characters in Hell House rather, are so annoying. Florence, this woman who's like a spiritualist / Christian pastor, new agey, whatever, is like the stereotypical annoying spiritualist woman you see in any kind of like haunted house investigation, like on TV or whatever. There's always, everybody's like setting up their science and their thermometers and their recorders and whatnot, and then there's some woman going in. It's like, the person in here is 60 and he's male and he's over in that corner, and that's fine. That's fine. Maybe you believe in that, but they're always so insistent. This is what I hated about her character in this novel. Is she'll say like, it's his son. His son is here in the room. I know it. Why won't you believe me? And the guy who's more science-minded is like, because I don't know you. And there's always, it's such a woman thing too. Like, but I know this is true. I'm telling you that I know this. Why don't you believe me? Well, how do you know this? Can you prove it to me? I'm telling you I know it. Why don't you believe me? That's not an argument. Shut up. She was so crazy annoying. I was delighted when she finally died. I just couldn't handle her. And the other characters weren't much better. The only character that kind of sort of quasi invested me was Fisher, the guy who'd been there before, but he ended up just kind of being a simp for Florence after a while. And I was just like, this is just not, like, I didn't enjoy the reading of it. I could see why it was well done. I could see how it was, a well-told story. I could see how it's, it's scary. It's in the, but by the end of it, like it was in the last few chapters, and man, I was just like, can I just read a summary of this, or do I have to read the rest of this? This is really annoying. Plus, the ending of it, Matheson does this thing in a lot of his work where he likes to try to scientifically describe the supernatural, or give a sort of, try to ground the supernatural into more of a scientific thing. Well, it's just science we haven't discovered yet. And, the ending could go either way a little bit, at the end of Hell House, but he does that in Hell House too, with like supernatural occurrences, poltergeist activity, or ghosts. He tried to do it with vampirism and I Am Legend, and I hated that. I mean, I'm just like, if you got to work that hard to suck every bit of supernatural wonder out of a supernatural story, then maybe you shouldn't be writing a supernatural story to begin with. I just don't like it. It's fine if you want to do something like The Haunting of Hill House, which lets delve into more of how the characters are psychologically haunted. Sure, that's fine. You're not going out of your way to say, and it's clearly just the energy and I don't know. I just don't like Matheson. I really don't. I know I'm in the minority. I know he's just like people's epic hero of science fiction and horror, but I can't stand him. I really don't like his work. I like his ideas. And if other people are collaborating on it, but I'll never read another book of his. I'm glad I read Hell House. I'm glad that Doug Brody mentioned it to me, because it is a seminal work, and I want to be able to say that I'd read it. And I can see some of its influence on ghost haunted house stories to come and whatnot. But he's just not for me. So again, if that just royally ticks you off, again, I'm only speaking from my taste. I'm not saying he's a crap writer. I'm not saying you should never read his work. If you're at all in line with my taste and what I like in a character, and that's the thing. Am I the only person that wants to invest in a character if I'm going to read a story? Maybe that's just a thing with me. Maybe other people aren't like that, but I find it hard to get through a story if I don't care about any of the characters. And it's not that I need to see myself personally in this character. No, I need to have some relatability, to connect some way to this character's motivations and their fears and whatnot. I watched The Haunting recently, which is the original film adaptation of Haunting of Hill House. And I can't remember the character's name, but the young woman who's such a nutcase, going in, you do relate to, I mean, you're not a nutcase like she is, but you know where she's coming from. And you do kind of, you're a little bit invested in the guy who got them all there and stuff like that. They're likable characters, even if you don't like everything about them, there's enough to invest in them. And I need that if I'm going to hang in there with a story. I just don't like, Neville's just what a simpy little man baby or womanish man. Just shut up, Neville. Go away. Anyway, so that's all. Yeah, Final Fantasy. All right, so some of you guys are agreeing with me here. No wine is Final Fantasy. Plus size back to our vampire says, I think the 1970 the vampire movies got bad. Which is why in the 80s they got better with Fright Night. And oh man, we're talking about the 80s with Fright Night and Lost Boys. Awesome. Even though Fright Night isn't a Dracula movie, Jerry Dandridge is very much a Dracula character. I mean, that's just, that's obvious. So, there was sort of a wave that we're talking about, but we just crested into the 70s now with our exploration. So we'll talk more as we go. I don't know what I'll do next week. I'll think about what's best to kind of continue the journey here for this year, but it's fun. Stephen M says, I'm the same way. I get it. I don't need to look at the character necessarily. I don't need to like the character necessarily, but I do need to be able to relate to them in some way in order to care about what happens to them. Exactly. And maybe some people, who aren't me might be able to relate to some of the characters in Hell House. They triggered me and all of my annoyance, buttons with them, which was, so anyway. All right, I have gone on, and I'm a little over an hour, and I am wiped out, and I'm going to go hang out with my dear wife. We're going to go do some anniversary celebrations tomorrow and do a couple places and go to some things and whatnot, which will be fun. But I hope you guys have a great week. Hope you have a great week to come, and I will be back next week. We're definitely not going to miss that week in our last pre-Halloween stream here. But hope you guys are staying safe out there and enjoying the season. And until next time, keep enjoying and digging deeper into the true blue monster stories you love. Thanks for watching.